Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Food History Happy Hour. This is episode 20. I almost didn't do Food History Happy Hour tonight because about 15 minutes ago, I found out that Ruth Bader Ginsburg died. And I'm very upset about it. But it is the first night of Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year, and we're talking about apples, and apples and honey are symbolic of prosperity for the new year. So since Ruth Bader Ginsburg was Jewish, I thought we should do it. Oh, I'm trying really hard not to cry right now. So yeah, say hi in the comments. Cheer me up. Talk about why you loved her. Wow. Not expecting to cry, you guys. What is happening? Anyway. We're going to make a cocktail. It's got apple cider in it. Hard cider, which I have a feeling I'm going to need. And some of you might be cocktailing along. You can tell me in the comments what you're making. And we're going to try and get through this without me getting too upset. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking about it or I'm going to cry. So instead, we're going to talk about apples and apple cider and hard cider. And I think we're going to start with the cocktail. Thank you, Carla. Thank you for being here tonight. The cocktail I'm making tonight is called the Jersey Cooler. It's from the 1946 Roving Bartenter. It's one of the simplest Jersey Cooler, Jersey cocktail recipes out there. There are a bunch. I posted some on Instagram. And actually this afternoon, I went and researched and found the earliest reference I could, which of course it was, is from Jerry Thomas's very famous How to Mix Drinks from 1862. It's called the Jersey Cocktail. In that one, it is called the Jersey Cocktail in a lot of bartenders' guides and cocktail recipes. And because it appears to have been invented by Jerry Thomas, who was native to New York, I think it is actually referring to New Jersey rather than Jersey, England, although both have pretty long hard cider traditions. Yes, Carla, a toast to Ruth Bader Ginsburg with apples and hard cider on Rosh Hashanah feels very appropriate. So that's what we're going to do today. So the recipe is very straightforward. I am leaving out one ingredient because I just didn't feel like getting it tonight. It calls for hard cider. I have myself some Angry Orchard here. Bitters. I'm going to use Angostura bitters. You could use orange bitters. Some recipes do call for them, but this recipe calls for Angostura bitters. And it also called for ice. And I was too lazy and upset to get ice. So my cider is nice and chilled. We're going to do it without ice. I did see also, I think the Jerry Thomas recipe says to use a small tumbler, which I'm like, how big is that actually? I'm not sure. A bunch of other recipes didn't really say a glass size, so I have just a little, not too small, 12-ounce cup here. I have my bitters. It calls for 2 or 3 shakes of bitters. I'm going to put in 3 because I like bitters. And then we have our cider. This is probably one of the simplest cocktails I've made on Food History Happy Hour. Heather, thank you. Pouring one out for RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, with the 1906 version, which I also posted on Instagram, which has sliced oranges in it. So I'm just gonna mix in the hard cider here. It smells delicious because of the bitters. There we go. The Jerry Thomas recipe calls for sugar, but I know the Angry Orchard is pretty sweet already, so I'm not putting it in. And the 1946 Roving Bartender version doesn't call for sugar either. So just hard cider and bitters. It tastes like fall. So here is to an amazing woman who spent almost all of her life in service to her country, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Thank you for everything that you've done. And I hope you're enjoying your new year wherever you are. Okay. So on that note, I thought we would talk a little bit about apples and apple cider. Before we get started, does anybody have any questions about apples or apple cider that you want me to investigate? I think Carl asked, when did the term cocktail start to be used? I'm not exactly sure, but it's pretty early on. I know someone has written the history of the term cocktail. I would have to look it up to be sure. So I don't know. Carla says the teetotaler is roaring with an apple slice. You could also make a non-alcoholic version of this with sweet cider and bitters if you wanted to, or it's basically like a cold version, a cold and slightly bubbly version of mulled cider, which you could also make. So I did a fun thing today. I did a Google Ngram viewer of hard cider and cider because I was interested to see like when the terminology hard cider came into use. And I realized pretty quickly that the data was corrupted because of the William Henry Harrison presidential campaign of 1840, which is the hard cider and log cabin campaign. Oh, Anna Catherine's interjecting that cider wasn't enough for her, so she made a Jack Rose of Applejack, which is pink. Brava, Anna Catherine, that sounds great. But yes, hard cider, log cabin hard cider was one of the slogans of the Harrison presidential campaign. He was running against Martin Van Buren, who is originally from Kinderhook, New York, which is not too far from where I live. And it kind of harkened back to the founders, which is a thing that was kind of happening in the 1840s. Like, we're coming off of several decades of peace and prosperity in the United States. Well, for white guys anyway. And so he was sort of like the populist candidate, and hard cider, being this sort of historic beverage even then, became a symbol of his campaign even after the campaign was over, right? Even after his presidency, because I'm pretty sure he won. I'm not super up on my 1840s presidential candidates. We're just gonna, yes, our 9th U.S. president. So, like, in subsequent presidential and campaigns and in other political campaigns, like a barrel of hard cider came to sort of symbolize people who were affiliated with his politics and policies. So my Google Ngram viewer did not really work out for that reason. There's a big spike in the 40s, and then so it's like kind of a little bit, and then a big spike, and then kind of a little bit, and then slowly, like in the 90s, it starts to sort of grow again. In comparison to things like rum and whiskey and straight cider, it pales in comparison. However, the term cider, I think for most of the 19th century, refers to hard cider. There, I did find a temperance book called Hard Cider. It's like a little novel. And it basically posits that hard cider, which is seen historically as this kind of wholesome, family-friendly, not super alcoholic drink, is like the gateway drug to hard liquor. That's one of their arguments. And there's a quote that I'm going to paraphrase, but it's like, hard cider leads to wine, wine leads to something else, I don't remember what, and then that leads to whiskey, just like the evil distilled alcohol that gets people so drunk. So that's why, one of the reasons why hard cider kind of falls out of favor in the United States is because of the temperance movement. I think Heather asked when I first posted that we were going to be talking about this topic tonight, what made hard cider fall out of favor? And there are a lot of different reasons. There's no like magic bullet. Like people like to talk about, oh, temperance killed hard cider, but it was already on the decline by the mid 19th century. Like I said, the William Henry Harrison campaign of 1840, him being the log cabin and hard cider candidate. Log cabins were not really in use in civilized society in the United States. It's sort of like this, you know, harkening back to pioneering. Even though that was still sort of happening, there were still frontiers. People were still moving westward and building log cabins. But it sort of harkened back to an earlier time, and he was associating himself with a particular type of American, the sort of hardy, pioneer, kind of slightly populist figure. Hard cider is a homemade beverage. It was not really widely commercially produced ever until the late 20th and definitely into the 21st century. So you had to have access to an orchard, and you had to stay in one place long enough to either plant an orchard or to harvest its fruit, right? It takes 5 to 8 years for a tree to really produce. And then, you know, depending on the variety, you might get anywhere between 10 and 100 years of production. But basically, you kind of have to be in one place long enough to harvest it, and it takes some fairly specialized equipment. You have to have grinders to grind up the apples into pulp. You have to have giant presses. You have to have something called a hair, which is like a kind of a fabric casing that you put the pulp in, so it doesn't just squish out the sides of the press. And then you have to be able to have the time for it to ferment into hard cider. Now, people did drink sweet cider, and they would drink sweet cider pretty much until it just started turning into hard cider, and then they would drink the hard cider, and eventually they would turn into vinegar, and then they would use the vinegar. Oh, Anna Catherine says something about hammer mills. I think I know what you're talking about, but I'm going to Google it just in case. Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's even more specialized. So that's a mill that like bashes things into submission, right? In the 19th century, you do get, especially in the mid 19th century, there's like this weird little cottage industry of small scale cider grinders. Like one of my first history jobs ever, I worked at a very small, just getting started living history farm, and I found in one of the barns an old cider press. They're really not very big. You know, they have like a little hopper that's like this big, and then a hand crank grinder, and then everything falls into like, it looks like a wooden barrel, but there's spaces between the slats, and then there's a grooved wooden base with like a little spout so you can catch the juice. So it's really fairly small scale compared to what I think a lot of people were doing earlier in the century, and certainly small scale compared to what they do in England. So Carla just asked a couple of great questions, which I'm going to get to. I'm going to answer one quickly. Apples are not indigenous to North America. There is an indigenous crab apple, but apples as we know them are not indigenous, and I'll get to where they come from later. And then Johnny Appleseed, John Chapman, was a real person. And I go into his story more in depth in a podcast I did on this very subject, also called Apples in America. But basically, he was a Swedenborgian missionary who believed that apples should only be grown from seed, and that grafting, which I'll also explain in a minute, was against God's will. And he sort of made a living for himself by planting apple seedlings in these little seedling orchards that he would make out in the wilderness. And then he would sell the seedlings to settlers, colonists coming westward. And that's how he would make his money. And he kind of was like preparing the way for westward settlement. Thank you, Anna Catherine, for answering. I will get into where they're from. So yes, hard cider is a homemade beverage. When we start to get the proliferation of distilled alcohol made in the United States, which really starts in, I mean, it's kind of happening in the 18th century, early 19th century, but really it's by sort of the middle of the century that distilleries really start to get underway. That's when you get less and less consumption of hard cider. Well, there's a lot of apocryphal stories about alcohol consumption in early America. Some of them are true. Early Americans did drink a lot of alcohol compared to modern Americans, a lot. And there's a couple of reasons why. One is that it was not easy to find trustworthy sources of fresh drinking water. They did exist. If you could find a spring, historically people would drink water fresh from a spring. But other sources of water were fairly contaminated because early Americans didn't understand germ theory, and indeed most Americans didn't understand germ theory until really the end of the 19th century. We're starting to get it in the 1840s. So mildly fermented beverages was one way to kind of fix our impure water problems, right? Because alcohol is a disinfectant, right? It's antibacterial, antimicrobial. It'll kill most of the things that will give you waterborne illnesses. So that's why people drank it, including children. Small beer, right, is something that the Pilgrims drank, even their kids. Cider, hard cider, is kind of a version of small beer. It's fairly lightly fermented fruit juice. And if anybody knows anything about how soda originally was made, it's lightly fermented, whatever, juice. Yeah, right. You mix yeast and sugar and water, and then whatever kind of flavoring, be it fruit juice or roots, right? If you're gonna have root beer or sarsaparilla, and that's how you get your early soda pops, but they're fermented. So if you put a lot of sugar in them, or if you let them keep fermenting, they're going to become more and more alcoholic. So everybody drank it, right? And that's part of the argument of the temperance movement, is that it's the gateway drug to hard liquor, right? So part of the reason why hard cider falls out of favor is because people weren't making it home as much. People who were moving westward did not have access necessarily, despite Johnny Appleseed, who died in the 1830s, 40s, I think. He only made it as far west as Indiana, right? So beyond that, not a lot of half-grown apple orchards waiting for you when you get out there. The other thing that's happening is that there are a number of German immigrants who start to emigrate to the United States in the first half of the 20th century, and they bring different beer brewing techniques with them. So As an ingredient in alcohol, grain is much more desirable than apples. Apples are big, they're heavy, they don't store that well, and it takes a fair amount of effort to turn them into cider. Grain is much easier to turn into beer, and the new brewing techniques that Germans brought with them made beer brewing easier and more palatable than a lot of British beer brewing traditions. So beer became kind of the prevalent, not that alcoholic drink of choice for those reasons. And then also in the mid-19th century, we start to get railroad expansion, and you start to get kind of the industrialization of food production, including beer production. So you can buy bottled beer. You don't have to make it yourself. You can buy bottled beer. You can buy bottled beer from far away because you have railroads. And the same thing with distilled alcohol. Distilled alcohol also becomes more popular because it'll get you drunk a lot quicker than beer. The other thing is that as people are moving into urban areas, they don't need the calories of beer as much, right? Or hard cider. They're fairly caloric drinks if you're drinking a lot of it. And if you're not doing hard physical labor, as many people were starting not to do, starting in the middle of the 19th century, you don't need those calories as much. So alcohol becomes more of a pleasure-related activity, alcohol consumption, rather than something that's helping you live. And then, of course, we do have the Temperance Movement, which is a direct response to the proliferation of hard distilled liquor in American society, in part because a lot of people, especially early on, were drinking distilled liquor much like they drank beer and cider, which is to say they drank a lot of it with much more deleterious effects than the far less alcoholic beer and hard cider. So then the other thing that contributes to the downfall of hard cider in America is the proliferation of apple agronomy, I guess we'll call it, and the rise of the dessert apple and the baking apple. So, and this is where we're going to talk a little bit about the origin of apples. So as Anna Catherine said it, Carla asked, apples are not native to North America except for crab apples. They are native to a mountainous area in Kazakhstan, and particularly a region called, I think it's called Almaty. And Almaty is from the phrase Alamata, which basically means father of apples. So you have these entire forests in the mountains of apple trees, and they're hugely genetically diverse. Like modern apple scientists and agriculturalists and orchardists go to Kazakhstan to study the genetics of apples and apple trees that are growing there, because that's basically the cradle from whence all apples came. It's also on the route of the Silk Road, which explains why apples kind of proliferate around the world. So maybe Anna Catherine can chime in a little bit here since she's the scientist and I'm not. But as far as I can tell, a lot of people know that apples, if you try and grow an apple from seed, you're going to get something completely different than the apple that you ate, right? But as far as I can tell, the reason why that is because apples are pollinated by insects, right, by bees. So you have to be, your apple blossom has to be pollinated in order to produce an apple. And they are fairly promiscuous in how they are pollinated. So the way one article explained it is, if you think about genetics and you think about, you're getting genetic material from your mother and your father, and it's combined in a variety of ways based on what are dominant and what are recessive genes, and that creates you. So you're some combination of your two parents, your mother and your father. So you're going to have traits from one and the other that are combined in you. And this example said, now imagine that was an apple, except for instead of two parents, you have like hundreds. Because that's how the pollination works. So apple seeds, you don't really know what you're going to get when you plant an apple seed because of how apples are pollinated. So a lot of apple varieties that we have today were discovered from wild apples. And that's also how apples in the forests of Kazakhstan became human food. One interesting theory is that the reasons why they developed in Kazakhstan as like big fruit is because they were trying to attract megafauna, like mammoths and stuff, to come and eat them and disperse the fruit. That's why the fruit is so big and heavy. But it's great for humans too. So all modern apples, all modern eating apples that you can buy in the store are effectively clones, right? They were not planted from seed. They're planted from grafting, which Anna Catherine is talking about in the comments. So you take a small branch from an apple tree that you like, that you know produces good apples, and you graft it onto rootstock, which is generally, depending on where you live, in more northerly areas, regions, it's crab apple tree that you graft the eating apple onto, because crab apples are very hardy trees, right? And then the tree like accepts that little branch, usually like the top part of it, right? And then ta-da, you get a tree that's going to grow those apples that you want. So that's how that works. So the development of eating apples for pies and desserts and salads, as opposed to cider apples, which have a very different flavor profile. They're often called bitter sharps because they are not good for eating, but they make good cider, right? You don't want them too sweet, but you want enough sugar so that they ferment properly. But the eating apples, the rise of eating apples in the latter half of the 19th century, I think, kind of pushes these heirloom cider apples out of most commercial orchards. And also, nobody's really at that point drinking hard cider, so nobody really cares about these varieties. Nobody's really researching these varieties and grafting them and trying to keep these heirloom trees alive. So that's another reason that hard cider kind of falls out of favor. It does continue to be made, I think, in like pockets, and people who live in rural areas with orchards are still making it pretty much throughout the 19th and 20th century. And it's really not until more recently, with people much more interested in local food systems, that we start to get a resurgence in hard cider production, which I am very happy with because I vastly prefer hard cider to beer and even some wine, which I'm sure Anna Catherine thinks is sacrilegious because she's an oenologist, but that's how I feel. Anyway. Anna Catherine has some cool trivia. The USDA National Germplasm Collection of Apples is in Geneva, New York, which is where she lives. And they do tours each 6th September, except for when there's COVID. Yeah, apples are cool, you guys. There's I'll post it in the blog for this episode, but there's this really awesome website called orangepippin.com that they don't just focus on apples, but most of their collection is on apples. And you can look up, it's like Google for heirloom apples. You can look up just about any heirloom variety, even kind of the functionally extinct ones, and it'll tell you about them. It's fantastic. So yeah, heirloom apples are awesome. All right, so that's about hard cider. Does anybody else have any questions about hard cider? For those of you who are just joining us, I'm drinking the Jersey Cooler without ice. It's basically hard cider and Angostura bitters, and it's delicious. Oh, Anna Catherine has another interesting comment about hard cider. She said groups of cider makers in New York have been taking trips to the UK to become familiar with the traditional cultivars that they've maintained over there. We have way too few to meet demand in our state. Yes, and I'm going to tell you that I followed just the other day on Instagram, let me find it. There is an orchard in Ankrum, New York, which is in the Hudson Valley. And what is it called? It's called, oh, where did they go? Oh, that's going to drive me crazy. I'm going to have to look it up. I can't find it, you guys. Anyway, I'll post it on the blog. They were sharing photos of heirloom apples in their orchard, and I had not heard of any of them, which is saying something. I mean, not really, because I'm not like an expert or anything, but I know a fair amount about some heirloom apple varieties. I definitely have my favorites. And a number of them were developed in the Hudson Valley of New York, like the Esopus Spitzenberg, which was developed in Esopus, New York, which is like 60 minutes, 45 minutes from my house, which is kind of cool. So yeah, they're not totally lost. And I guess the great thing about grafting is if there's a tree still alive, you can repopulate it. There's also a group in Washington State called the Lost Apple Project, which is trying to find heirloom apple trees that are like hidden on people's property that maybe people thought were extinct, and nope, here's a couple old trees that we didn't know about, so we're going to hurry up and try and save them. And one of the matriarch trees just died, I think, in Washington State, which is sad. But because you can graft, they propagated a bunch of saplings from that tree before it died, which is great. Anna Catherine says Angry Orchard is establishing a heritage orchard in the Hudson Valley. That's cool. Yeah, definitely. I am very pro heirloom apple. I am very lucky to live in the Hudson Valley where there are still heirloom apple orchards. And I am also very lucky to live near a small regional grocery chain called Adams that stocks a lot of locally produced apples. Like I can get Damon wine saps in that grocery store. They also do like Paula Reds and Ginger Golds and Jonna Golds, which are like my favorite. Even though they're not heirloom, but they have a ton of really interesting apple varieties that you can get. And they also have a couple heirloom pears, which is nice. I bought clap pears the other day, and then we had to go away and they're still in my fridge, so I don't know if they're good anymore, but it was cool to be able to buy other varieties of pears. Anna Catherine, you talk about heirloom apples as much as you want in the comments. I don't mind at all. So let's talk about apple varieties since we're on the topic. And I want to talk a little bit about Red Delicious. So I talked about this in this podcast that I did a couple of years ago, so I'm just kind of going to give you the overview. If you want all the details, you can go listen to the podcast. I promise it's good. But the Red Delicious apple has sort of like everything that's wrong with the apple industry is sort of encompassed in the Red Delicious apple. So originally, the Red Delicious apple started out as an apple called the Hawkeye. And it was from an apple tree that the owner tried to cut down like a bunch of times, and it just kept coming back. So he entered it in this contest, but offered by Stark Brothers Nursery, which is still around. Yes, Anna Catherine, Red Delicious is not delicious, and we're going to talk about why. So it starts out as a delicious apple. It's like elongated, right? Which modern Red Delicious still are. They're not round. They're like more elongated. But it was red and yellow striped. And they entered it in this contest under the name Hawkeye. And it won. So Stark Brothers bought the rights and started grafting like crazy to reproduce it. It became super popular as an eating apple. And there was, a couple of years later, a guy, I think it's in New Jersey, had one branch of his Stark's Delicious apple that produced bright red apples, like way before the rest of the tree, which is weird. So he contacted Stark Brothers, and they paid a lot of money for that branch and started grafting that instead. So their Stark's Delicious became known as Red Delicious, in part because it was red and also because somebody else had been marketing a golden delicious apple. And it was very red. It was uniformly red. It had thicker skin than the other apples, so it didn't bruise or get damaged on the skin as easily. And that meant that it shipped well. And so these apples start to be kind of selected for thick, dark red skin because that's what ships well. And they get sent by the train loads, these seedlings, to the Willamette Valley of Washington State. So Washington State becomes known as like Red Delicious territory. And fruit grading, apple grading, starts to be influenced by the Red Delicious. So like the highest grade of apple is unblemished, all red, which if you know anything about heirloom apples, they come in all colors, and red is like not the most common color. And then they store well, right? So those become the criteria for apples. And so guess who makes all those criteria perfectly? The Red Delicious. So it becomes sort of like the apple in the United States, but as the years go on, it becomes blander and sweeter. The skin is like tough and kind of bitter, and they're just not good apples. They're not crisp, but they're kind of mealy. I don't even like them for like applesauce or baking. They're not good. But they are not the same as the Hawkeye apple, the original Stark's Delicious, right? So there's this huge glut on the market of apples in the 1990s. And Bill Clinton actually has to sign a bailout for Washington State orchards because they've specialized so heavily in Red Delicious. And starting in the 90s, the demand for Red Delicious was waning, that they had to get a government bailout. Because, of course, when you have an orchard, you can't just plant new trees next year and get an apple crop. Like, shifting tastes, shifting American tastes is like the apple orchards are like the giant cruise ship, right? And American taste is like a speedboat. And so turning toward American taste takes some time usually, although not as much time as it used to, because apple trees now 3 to 5 years for production in a lot of the dwarf and semi-dwarf varieties. And then one of the reasons why it's hard to find heirloom apple trees is that a lot of orchardists, after 8 to 10 years, they rip out their apple trees because that's when the production levels start to decline. Apple trees will keep producing for up to 100 years, especially the older varieties, but production levels start to decline. The other reason why a lot of heirlooms, it just occurred to me now, the other reason why a lot of heirlooms fall out of favor is because a lot of them have alternate production years. So like 1 year you'll get like a bumper crop of apples, and then the next year you won't get very many at all. And when you're trying to run a business, that's a little unpredictable. So that's why a lot of orchards, especially orchards that were established in the latter half of the 19th century into the early 20th century as commercial orchards, you don't see those varieties as much anymore, and that's why Red Delicious is not delicious anymore. I hope that someday somebody will find some old Stark's Delicious tree, if they haven't already, I guess. I don't know. I haven't looked it up. And that we can maybe taste what the original delicious apple was supposed to taste like, which hopefully would be actually delicious. One of the other reasons why Red Delicious start to fall out of favor in the 90s is because we start to get introductions of Asian apple varieties like Fuji and Gala, which are both very popular. And then here in the United States, apple research continues, right? Because of agricultural extension and agricultural colleges, we have agricultural research stations, and apple orchards are one of them. One of them is at Cornell University, where Anna Catherine works, right? The University of Minnesota is another big one. And the University of Minnesota developed two very popular recent varieties, Honeycrisp and Zestar. Honeycrisp is like ubiquitous now. I can actually get Zestar in my favorite little grocery store. I have some in my fridge. I haven't tried them yet. And here in the Northeast, as Anna Catherine is mentioning, there's Empire, there's Makun. You see a lot of Mutsu, which is another Japanese import. And then the very famous Macintosh, which is, in my opinion, a terrible eating apple, fresh eating apple, but is renowned as a baking apple, has a very good flavor. So a lot of people use it for sauce and pies. Then the other famous one is Granny Smith, which is an apple I do not like personally, but a lot of historic recipes will call for tart, very tart apple. So Granny Smith is a good analog for those style of apples. Okay, any other questions on heirloom apples or apples themselves in general? That's awesome. Anna Catherine was on the apple tasting panel at the University of Minnesota when they were evaluating Honeycrisp. Okay, that's really cool. Heather says Granny Smith forever. Yeah, I'm not a huge fan. I like my apples sweeter than that. But as we've established, I have a bit of a sweet tooth, so. Cool. All right, so the last thing I wanted to talk about is how apples are consumed in the United States. And there's a very famous phrase, American as apple pie. Now, apparently this phrase doesn't arrive until the 20th century, and it's used to describe one of the first ladies. I'm forgetting who. I think it might be Mamie Eisenhower, but I'm going to Google to be sure. Oh gosh, now I can't find it. The original quote was that whichever first lady it was, they were American as apple pie and corn pone. But of course, everybody forgets about poor corn pone. Nobody likes that. Oh no, it's Lou Henry Hoover. Okay, sorry, not Mamie Eisenhower. Lou Henry Hoover in the 1920s. But as many of you probably know, apple pie isn't American at all, right? We've already established that apples are not native to the United States, although they do grow well here. And pie is also not native to the United States, although corn pone is. So maybe we should honor our indigenous food contributions by changing the phrase to American as corn pone. But apple pie becomes American for a variety of reasons. So the first is that, as we've already established, apples are fairly easy to grow in the United States, right? And even sour, kind of not very good apple pies, if you have enough sugar, apples, if you have enough sugar, can be made into fairly decent apple pie. The other thing that I think we've talked about before on Food History Happy Hour is that pie, you do not need an oven to make pie. And for most of the 18th century and really the first half, maybe even the first 2/3 of the 20th century, the 19th century, most people did not have ovens, particularly people living in frontier areas, right? It's really not until you get railroads, the widespread use of railroads, that you get the shipment of cast iron, coal, or wood-fired stoves, which have more reliable ovens, right? Otherwise, you have to have a bake oven. Or if you're traveling a lot, a Dutch oven, right? And it's kind of hard to make a cake in a Dutch oven, but it's very easy to make a pie in a Dutch oven. Pies also don't require any leavener. So if you have flour and fat and something to put in it, you can make a pie fairly easily. That's why pie becomes so ubiquitous in the United States. Pie is a direct descendant of British pies, which date back to the medieval period when the pie crust was more like the container and not meant to be eaten. But that's how it turns out in the United States. And because apples are one of the most ubiquitous fruits throughout the country, right? They kind of transcend geography and climate. That's part of the reason why apple pie becomes so widespread. The other reason why, although I don't know why we don't say it as American as pumpkin pie, because that is truly American, but apple pie and pumpkin pie are both very closely associated with New England cuisine. And in the 19th century, particularly the latter half of the 19th century, as people were trying to establish what is American food, there was a lot of interest and rhetoric around the Pilgrims and early America and New England as like the cradle and birthplace of the United States, which kind of ignores the contributions of the other parts of the country that were settled just as early, right? But that sort of becomes part of the American mythology, that New England is the birthplace of America and American ideals, and this kind of colonial New England style cuisine is true American cuisine, which, you know, has a lot of complicated history behind it because it's not actually American. Certainly not actually a white American, because there's a very heavy influence in New England of indigenous foods and indigenous foodways. But that's kind of what is considered American for most of the 19th and most of the 20th century, and probably also today, which if you look at Thanksgiving foods, which we'll talk about in November, a lot of them are traditionally very New England foods, which, you know, you can argue whether or not that's actually American, but that's kind of how it happens. So, apple pie, both American and not actually American. Technically speaking, not an indigenous American food, but I think probably is one of the best representatives of American food in terms of describing the United States as sort of a slightly white supremacist, settler colonial set of ideas. So I think that's why apple pie persists as a sort of quintessential American food, even though corn pone is far more indigenous American and representative, but it's not a sweet dessert. So that's probably also why it doesn't come out. Oh, Heather Taylor, fun fact, I have the first 1800s stamped stove/oven that was in Anna Catherine's old house. We found it in the crawl space. Wonder if apple pies were made of it. They probably were. Probably every kind of pie that there was fruit for or meat for or whatever was available went in there. Right? Lots of rhetoric in the 19th century about how much men love pie. So maybe we'll have to do an episode about gendered desserts. But yeah, pie is a pretty quick and easy way to get a lot of calories and a way to serve fruit in an appetizing way. All right. We made it through, everybody. Does anybody have any last questions or comments about apples? I'm going to maybe drink the rest of my cocktail. If you're just joining us, we've been talking about apples here on Food History Happy Hour. I made the Jersey Cooler, which is hard cider and Angostura bitters. It tastes like fall. It's delicious. I highly recommend it. And I'll just give it a couple of minutes if anybody has any more questions. No. Okay, there's more story behind Anna Catherine's house. Anna Catherine says, Heather and I became friends because she bought my grandmother's house and searched us out. My great-grandfather died in her house after asking his wife for an apple. What a crazy connection to tonight's topic. Oh, Heather says, anyone know if the U.S. did any of the French-style cider with champagne yeast, like Normandy cider? That is a good question. I don't know if it was made in the United States, but there is also another type of hard cider called Cider, C-Y-S-E-R, which is sweetened with and fermented with honey. So it's like an apple mead, which is kind of interesting. And there's also Perry, which is a type of cider made from pears, which is also very British and is very hard to find in the United States. There are a few people making it. Swedes also famously make Perry, but it's not easy to find. Elizabeth says, pie is also fairly portable, since you can hold a piece by the crust and eat it without utensils if you want. Or you could make hand pies, right? Although that really requires more of an oven than a Dutch oven. But yes, Anna Catherine is advocating for finding local cider. I do recommend it. I feel like, as I'm sure Anna Catherine would say about wine, there is a cider for every taste. Some of the more commercial ones, like Angry Orchard, are sweeter. But if you don't like sweet alcohol, they do make much drier versions of it. And if you live in an area where apples are produced, which a lot of people in the United States do, I recommend that you find a local cider. Or if you don't drink alcohol, or you're more interested in dessert, find an orchard that still has heirloom apples. A lot of them don't advertise their heirloom apples, even when they have them. So I recommend calling them up and asking them if they have heirloom apples, because I want there to be way more of a market for heirloom apples in the United States. There are a couple of, if you're a Midwesterner, there are a couple of really interesting, more famous heirloom apples that you can sometimes find on the market. So in the upper Midwest, the Haralson apple, which is quite dry. And then if you live in the southern Midwest, there's the Arkansas Black, which is an almost black apple that apparently you can't eat until it's been stored for a while in cold storage. So definitely check out apples if you're in the area. And I hope to make it to an apple orchard this year so I can do some apple picking and maybe make some apple sauce, right? Okay. I think I'm going to sign off for tonight, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you, those of you who joined, who cocktailed along. And a final toast to the irreplaceable Ruth Bader Ginsburg. We're all going to miss you lots. So with that, I'm Sarah Wasberg Johnson. This has been the Food History Happy Hour. We will see you again in 2 weeks when I think it'll be October. So I think we're going to talk about pumpkins and pumpkin spice, the controversial pumpkin spice. So thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you next time. Good night.